Hey everybody, I'm going to do this story, one that has been dear to me and that has been around for almost 70 years, and no justice was ever brought to this young man, Emmett Till. And guys, I think that's why I am so compelled to do the Shanquella Robinson story, because there was no justice for Emmett Till ever. And I would not want to see that happen with Shanquella and her family not ever receiving justice for that tragedy. I actually did this video over a year ago, but just could never bring myself to post it. And it wasn't because the movie came out. It was actually because so many years I've been so compelled and so captivated by this story. And I found a lot, it was very emotional, guys. I found a lot of information that I did not know, and I want to share it with you guys today. So I'm going to go on and get my disclaimer out of the way because I really think I need to do it here. Thank you, guys. Everything on this video is alleged. This video is being made for informational, entertainment, and educational purpose through the Fair Use Act. No copyright infringement is intended. And in the case of a criminal act, everyone is innocent until proven guilty. Money. Something we all love, something we all need and have to have in order to live, and something that we have all always known as the root of all evil. Welcome to the town of Money, Mississippi, a town that has seen troubles and trials. In 1955, Money, Mississippi was a small town known for its racism and segregation. The residents there had always accepted the fact that if you were a black person and you lived in Money, every day life for you would be a life of segregation, intimidation, and separation. The town of Money still displayed the signs of hate and inequality, like the white and black signs at the drinking fountains and restrooms. The black residents had to step off of the sidewalk for the whites, and no black could look at a white person in the eye. But on August 28th of that year, Money, Mississippi would be shaken up by the tragic murder of a 14-year-old boy that we all know as Emmett Till. Many remember the story of Emmett Till. It happened a long time ago. But even now, to the day, the story of Emmett Till, although he is no longer with us, his story is still alive. Emmett's mother, Mamie Till, was 2 years old when her family relocated to the outskirts of Chicago, Illinois, to a town called Argo. Mamie grew up in Argo and excelled in her young life. Not only was she the first black student to make the A honor roll, but being the trailblazer that she was, Mamie made her family and her community proud by her accomplishment of being the fourth black student to graduate from the mostly white populated school, Argo Community High. After graduation, Mamie was one of the first black people to be hired for a civil service position. At age 18, Mamie met Emmett's father, Louis Till, who was also 18 years old. He was a popular young man in her community, and Mamie knew this was the man she wanted to spend her life with. Although he was more streetwise and wasn't trying to gain the academic success that Mamie always pursued, she married him anyway. A year later, on July 25, 1941, Mamie gave birth to a son and named him Emmett Louis Till, nicknamed Bo. He was the only child born to Mamie and Louis Till. Mamie and Lewis's marriage was a rocky one, filled with abuse and infidelity by Lewis. After violating the restraining order that Mamie had issued on him, Lewis appeared in court and was given a choice of enlisting in the Army or going to jail. So in 1943, Lewis Teal decided to join the Army, and this led to the permanent separation of Mamie and Lewis's marriage. 10 years later, she discovered that the willful misconduct was the result of an incident where Lewis and another man named Fred McMurray had been charged for the rape and murder of an Italian woman, and that both men were convicted by an Army court-martial. Their sentence was documented as death by hanging. Emmett never knew his father, and Mamie was very protective of Emmett. As a child, Emmett suffered with the debilitating disease of polio, and even though Emmett beat the odds of the disease, he would be left with the disorder of stuttering. But he never let that stop him. He loved to pull pranks on his friends and was quick to tell jokes. He grew up to be a confident and outgoing teenager who was very popular among friends. In the summer of 1955, Emmett's great uncle, Moses Wright, but they called him Mose, came from the Mississippi Delta to visit his family. When it was time to leave, Mose agreed to take Emmett's cousin, Wheeler Parker, back with him to Mississippi. Emmett wanted to go along, but at first his mother would not agree. Mamie worried that with Emmett's outgoing personality and him always pulling pranks, she was afraid that he would find trouble in Mississippi. Eventually, Mamie gave in, though, and said it was okay for Emmett to join his Uncle Mose and his cousin on the journey back to Mississippi. Of course, she had to talk to Emmett to let him know the ways that the blacks had to live in the South, and she told him to be careful of the whites because life in Mississippi Delta was a lot different than life in Chicago. During that talk, she decided to give Emmett a ring that once belonged to his late father, Lewis Teal. On the morning they were scheduled to leave, Mamie and Emmett arrived at the 63rd Street station a little late. Emmett was rushed to board the train and Mamie said to Emmett, "Where are you going? You haven't kissed me goodbye. And how do I know I will ever see you again?" At that time, Mamie had no idea how true that statement would become. Emmett's Uncle Mose was a sharecropper and had been in the cotton industry most of his adult life. Mose was also a preacher at one of the neighborhood churches in town. He and his family spent long days in the cotton fields, and once they got back to Mississippi, Mose had Emmett and his cousins work in the cotton field alongside him. After only half a day of working in the fields, the young boys decided to drive into town to unwind and spend some of the money they'd earned. The local general store was called Bryant's Grocery and Meat Market. It was owned by a local man named Roy Bryan, along with his wife Carolyn. On the day the boys visited to the Bryan store, Roy Bryan was out of town, leaving his wife Carolyn to handle the business alone. Emmett's cousin took turns going into the store to buy soft drinks and candy. When it was Emmett's turn to enter the store, he went in and bought 2 pieces of bubble gum. The accounts of what actually happened inside the store when Emmett went in differs from what the boys said and what was reported by Carolyn Bryant, who said Emmett had touched her and made sexual remarks telling her he had been with white women before. In Mississippi, it is strictly forbidden for any black person to touch a white person. According to the boys, when Emmett left the store, he decided to let out a loud woof whistle, and apparently this action offended Carolyn Bryant. She exited the store and headed to her car. Everyone outside of the store ran off to avoid the possibility of being shot. Emmett and his 2 cousins got into the car and headed back to the farm. During the ride home, Emmett begged his cousins not to tell his Uncle Mose what had happened at the Bryant Grocery. The boys all agreed not to tell Mose and remained quiet about the encounter. According to the boys, 2 days passed and they never were approached by anyone about what had happened at Bryant's Groceries. But on the third night, in the wee hours of the morning, there was a loud knock on Mose Wright's front door. Mose asked who was there. A voice answered and said, "This is Mr. Bryant, and I want to talk to you and that boy." When Mose opened the door, there were two white men, Roy Bryant and his half-brother, J.W. Milam, standing on the porch, and a black man standing behind them. One of the white men was holding a pistol in one hand and a flashlight in the other. According to Moses' son, Simeon Wright, who was 12 years old at the time and was sleeping in the same room as Emmett, the two white men entered the bedroom and told Emmett to get up and get dressed. Simeon said his parents pleaded with the two men not to take Emmett. Moses' wife Elizabeth even offered them money, and according to Simeon, Roy Bryant hesitated as though he would consider her offer, but his brother J.W. Milam wasn't interested and proceeded to take Emmett with them. Simeon said J.W. Milam stopped and asked his father, Mose Wright, "How old are you, preacher?" Mose answered that he was 64 years old, and J.W. Milam responded, "If you tell anyone about this, you won't live to get 65, Simeon said. That was when he realized that J.W. Milam was not afraid of the law. Emmett was taken outside to a waiting vehicle, and one of the men asked someone inside the car if Emmett was the one. According to Mose, a soft voice that he felt was a woman's voice answered yes. They put Emmett in the vehicle and drove off. From that moment on, no one really knows the truth about what happened to Emmett. An 18-year-old witness named Willie Reed, who shared his story, said the next morning after Emmett was taken from his uncle Mose Wright's home, he saw Emmett on the back of a truck with 4 white men and 2 black men. 2 of the men were Roy Bryant and his brother J.W. Milam. Reed said he saw the truck parked in front of a barn that he knew was managed by J.W. Milam's brother Leslie Milam. Reed said he could hear beating and screams coming from the barn. He felt the screams were from the men beating Emmett Till. He said shortly after the 4 white men came out of the barn and J.W. Milam walked up to him carrying a .45 caliber gun and asked him, "Did you hear anything?" Reed, being afraid of what was happening, answered, "Nah, I haven't heard anything." After testifying at the trial, Willie Reed, being afraid that he too would be killed, left Mississippi and moved away to Chicago and was eventually admitted to a local hospital after suffering from a nervous breakdown. Another local resident named Odie Brown said he saw a black man named Levi Collins, who he referred to by the nickname Too Tight, washing blood from a truck he recognized belonged to J.W. Milam. Odie Brown asked Too Tight where all the blood came from. He said Too Tight came across a shoe and said, "This is his shoe," and Odie asked, "Whose shoe?" Odie said Too Tight answered the shoe belonged to Emmett Till. When the trial started, Too Tight had apparently disappeared from the area, and when he was eventually found and questioned, he vehemently denied having any involvement in the killings. Sometime later, his wife reportedly left the Mississippi Delta with her 4 children when she was notified that her husband had been killed and found in a river. Another black man, Henry Lee Loggins, also denied being involved with Emmett's murder. Both men were said to be former employees of J.W. Milam. It was rumored that Henry Loggins could not be found during the trial either because he had been locked up in several different jails under an assumed name to avoid being found and required to testify about his knowledge in the killing. On August 31st, 3 days after Emmett Till was abducted, a young man named Robert Hodges was fishing along the Tallahatchie River and saw what he thought was a pair of legs sticking up out of the river and realized that it was a body. He immediately reported his discovery to the local officials. When they arrived at the river and pulled the body out of the water, they noted that Emmett had a 75-pound industrial fan that had been reported stolen from a cotton gin tied around his neck with razor-sharp barbs. Emmett had been beaten beyond recognition. He was missing his right eye that had apparently been plucked out of his face and one of his ears had been cut off. He also had a gunshot wound just above his ear. When Uncle Mose was called to identify his body, he could only say for certain that it was Emmett because of the ring on his finger that his mother had given him before he left Chicago that once belonged to his father, Louis Teal. The local sheriff, Clarence Strider, wanted Emmett to be buried immediately and supposedly ordered the family to have him buried before nightfall, but his mother, Mamie Teal, insisted she wanted her son brought back to Chicago and buried there. So with the help of a local funeral home called A.A. Rayner and some political input, Mamie was able to bring Emmett's body back to Chicago, but only under the agreement that once the body reached Chicago, that they would not open the box that held his lifeless body. But Mamie Teal defied that order and insisted that she be allowed to see her son, even if she had to open the box herself. Once the box was opened and Mamie inspected her son's body, starting at his feet and worked her way up to his head. When she saw the horrific damage that had been inflicted upon her son, Mamie instructed the funeral director to not do anything to make him look better. She wanted the world to see what the killers had done to her 14-year-old son. On the day of Emmett's funeral, thousands of mourners gathered at the Roberts Temple Church of God in Christ, located on the south side of Chicago. During an open casket viewing and funeral, it was reported that more than 5,000 people showed up. The old and young from all over the Chicago area came to look upon the mutilated body of Emmett Till lying in the casket under a glass shield. Many even brought their young children to let them learn what the face of oppression and injustice looked like. Others knew that this event would be remembered throughout the history of the world. Meanwhile, back in Mississippi, due to all of the media attention, the state officials knew that this would not just go away. To ease the tensions that were mounting from the tragic killing, they decided to appoint a special prosecutor in order to file charges against Emmett's killers, Roy Bryant and J.W. Milam. When the trial began, the news media crews from all over the world gathered together in the town of Sumner to cover the trial of Emmett Till. The story of his death had become international news. Fearing a radical change of life as they knew it, the residents of Mississippi gathered together in support of the killers. It had been said that every white attorney in Tallahatchie County joined together in defense of Roy Bryant and J.W. Milam. The trial started on September 19, 1955. Regardless of the sweltering heat of the day, the courtroom was packed with curious spectators who wanted to know the details and outcome of this notorious trial. As expected, the courtroom was completely segregated, separating the whites from the blacks. The reporters from the North were somewhat surprised at what they were witnessing. One of the arguments presented by the defense attorneys was that the body in question was not that of Emmett Till, and that Mamie Till and the NAACP had made up this story. When asked by the news reporter, Mamie assured them that she knew this was her son. The prosecutor's most compelling witness was Emmett's 64-year-old uncle, Mose Wright, who, because of many threats directed towards him, had been hiding prior to his testimony. Without hesitation, Mose Wright stood up from the witness stand and pointed directly at Roy Bryant and J.W. Milam and named them as the two men who had come here to his home and taken Emmett during the night. When asked if the men who had come to his home and taken Emmett were present in the courtroom, Mose Wright stood to his feet in the witness stand and pointed towards the two men and stated, "Dar he," meaning there he is. In fear of retaliation from the angry white residents, Mose left his home and took the train to Chicago. He never returned after the trial and made a life for himself and his family in Chicago until his death on August 3rd, 1977, at the age of 85. The murder trial ended in an acquittal for Roy Bryant and J.W. Milam. The jury concluded that the prosecution had failed to prove that the body pulled from the Tallahatchie River was that of Emmett Till. It took just 67 minutes before they rendered the verdict, and some of the jurors were overheard saying it would not have taken that long, but they had stopped during the deliberations to drink a bottle of soda pop. Roy Bryant and his wife Carolyn Bryant, or his brother J.W. Milam, were never indicted on kidnapping charges. No person has ever served time for Emmett's kidnapping and ultimate murder. A few months later, through an attorney and the fact that they could not be charged again due to the double jeopardy law, Roy Bryant and J.W. Milam agreed to do an interview for Look magazine, where they confessed to the murder and gave details of how they killed Emmett on that warm summer morning. In turn, they received the payment of $4,000 for the story. Roy and Carolyn Bryant eventually divorced, and Carolyn moved away from Money, Mississippi, and eventually remarried. She now goes by the name of Carolyn Dunham. She has been known to have lived in several states, including Kentucky and North Carolina. 66 years later, in June 2022, researchers and family members of Emmett Till were allowed to search through old records in the basement of the courthouse in Mississippi and successfully found the original warrant that was issued on August 29, 1955. Carolyn Bryant Dunham was listed on the warrant as one of the officials in the kidnapping of Emmett Till. At the time the warrant was found, it was believed that she was living in the state of North Carolina with her son's family. Everyone involved in the trial were aware of Carolyn Bryant Dunham being named on the warrant. Some have said that the sheriff stated they were unable to find her to serve the warrant, even though she was in the courthouse during the trial by her husband's side every day. But during the trial, reporters said that when they asked the sheriff if he planned to arrest her, he stated, "We're not going to bother the woman. She has 2 small children to take care of." After the warrant surfaced, the Mississippi Attorney General refused to reopen the case, and Carolyn Bryant to this day still remains a free woman. It is reported that 19 years after Emmett's murder, Leslie Milam, the brother who managed the barn where Emmett Till was savagely beaten, had his wife call in their preacher, a man named Macklin Hubbard from Cleveland, Mississippi, to ask him to come to their house because her husband wanted a minute of his time. When the minister got to the house, Leslie Milam's wife escorted him to the room where her husband was lying on a sofa. Minister Macklin Hubbard stated that Leslie wanted to confess his involvement in Emmett Till's murder. He said Leslie Milam told him that he knew of him to be a man of God and wanted to relieve himself of the secrets and guilt he had held on to for all these years. The minister stated he prayed with Leslie and then left their house. Leslie Milam died the next morning. Records show that Leslie Milam was born on December 23, 1925, and died August 30, 1974, at the age of 48. He is buried in Drew Cemetery in Drew, Mississippi, located in Sunflower County. Roy Bryant was born January 24, 1931, and died September 1, 1994, at the age of 63. He is buried in Lawton Cemetery in Ruleville, Mississippi, located in Sunflower County. J.W. Milam, whose real name was John William Milam, was born February 18, 1919, and died on December 31, 1980, at the age of 61. He was buried in Green Lawn Memorial Gardens, Greenville, Mississippi, located in Washington County. It is reported that all three died from cancer. No one is completely sure about the birth date of Carolyn Bryant, but in my research, it showed she was born in 1934. The only date I found was July the 23rd, 1934. I am not positive whether that is the correct date or not, but that is the date that I found. As of today, she is still alive. The sad injustice is that it only took 27 minutes for the jury to acquit 14-year-old Emmett Till's killers. And today, the year 2022, marks 67 years since the tragedy, and no one has ever been held accountable for his death. Years later, in an interview, Mamie Till stated that Emmett's death was the opening of the civil rights movement. She said, "He was the sacrificial lamb of the movement." After a lifetime of public speaking about the death of her son, Emmett Louis Till, his mother, Mamie Till, died from a heart failure on January 6, 2003. She was 81 years old. Thank you all for coming to my channel and listening to this story, this most touching story with me. And I want to leave it with this Bible verse. "And having come in, the angel said to her, 'Rejoice, highly favored one. The Lord is with you. Blessed are you among women.'" That will be found at Luke chapter 1, verse 28. Thank you, Mamie Till, for your sacrifice, and thank you for your time and your efforts that you have given in service to the civil rights movement to find justice for people of color, even though justice was never brought to you for the tragedy of your son, Emmett Louis Till. Thank you for coming, everybody, and I hope that you enjoyed the story of Emmett Till.